So, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. It's a pleasure for me to open this workshop, and I wish to thank you and Professor Saucier for organizing this event. I think that the link between this school, the Florence School of Regulation, and the European Network of Water Regulators, WAREG, and ARERA is getting stronger since we, as a regulator, look to the Florence School of Regulation as a strategic partner for research and training. So this seminar in particular is focused on EU reforms in the first session, on innovation and digitalization in the second session, and then on impacts and climate change and pandemic. So with this very short introduction, I just want to bring the point of view of regulators on these issues addressed. So starting from the EU water reform, everybody knows that in the next month, the water legislation will be deeply revised by the European Commission and the European institutions, starting from the new drinking water directive approval, which will bring a higher level of transparency in the relationship among water utilities and customers, and of course, bringing new standards for water quality and a risk-based approach. But then the EU Commission has recently opened two consultation procedures. The first one on a zero pollution initiative for promoting the reduction of pollution for soil, water, and air. And so water utilities and regulators are engaged in this kind of consultation. And the second consultation procedure is linked to the sewage sludge directive. So furthermore, in the next month, will be opened also the consultation on urban wastewater treatment directive. So this package with the recent European Agreement on the reduction of greenhouse gas emission represent a potential factor of deep innovation for the water sector. I think that water utilities and maybe water regulators could really support the European Commission in deploying this kind of reform, starting from their participation to the consultation procedure, but at the same time, once approved, regulator could support the deployment of directive and the achievement of the target of the goal that will be set by this new directive. Regulators are supporting European Commission and national government also in the activity and in the long-term planning linked to the European Green Deal and connected to the recovery and resilience plan, so the next generation EU. In particular, in this kind of long-term planning, the economic regulators can hold multiple roles in the public funds spending procedures. First of all, like it occurs in Italy, for example, in looking to the relationship between the national authority and the national government, regulators can identify and screen projects eligible for the recovery, the next generation EU. At the same time, we can verify the compliance with specific conditions provided by law and with targets set by regulation, and then we can check the tariff sustainability of the new investments covered with the next generation EU. Finally, regulators could support national government and the European Commission in order to monitor the investment realization and to authorize payment. So this is a further rule that regulator could really exert, looking to this huge investments reform carried out by European Commission. Looking to the second part of this conference, that address the issue of innovation and digitalization. We think that as regulator, that three main points should be addressed looking for digitalization, that are georeferencing of water and wastewater mains, remote control systems of plants and mains, and digitalization of metering, such as the deployment and massive deployment of smart meter. In this sense, regulators could carry out the estimation of investment requirements for digitalization and innovation in the water sector. And recently, also in the light of the Next Generation EU, the national authority, the Italian national authority, estimated the investment for digitalization in the Italian water utilities that approximately is around 1.6, 1.9 billion of euros, to covering the gap for a full georeferencing of Italian mains, water mains and wastewater mains, and a full deployment of smart meter and a full deployment of remote control systems. So in our view, an economic regulator could provide a direct stimulus to digitalization and innovation, not only estimated by the estimation of investment needs, but also by giving specific targets in terms of rate of smart meter deployed per year, or kilometers of main network monitored with remote control systems. So furthermore, in many cases, an indirect stimulus is already provided with, for example, in Italy, with rules for frequency and timeliness of invoice that induce water utilities to improve their measurement procedure, also adopting digital device, and such as KPIs for the reduction of water leakages could indirectly provide a stimulus for improving digitalization and metering. Last but not least, just a couple of words on the third session, that is the one on emergency regulation arising with the pandemic. I think that during the first wave of pandemic, regulators reacted promptly, and half of WAREG members autonomously realized action to mitigate the effects of pandemic on operators and customers. First of all, a large part of WAREG members changed the aims of regulations in order to improve the customer protection measures to protect customers against the financial crisis carried out by the pandemic. So a large part of WAREG members, approximately 30% of WAREG members, suspended the procedures against default payers, and introduced a compulsory payments by installments for poor peoples, or for people hit by the crisis. A second aim carried out by the emergency regulation is the derogation to normal rules in order to protect also water utilities which have met difficulties in meeting in achieving their regulatory targets. And with this goal, we introduce as a national authority, but a large part of WAREG members make this. We introduced a specific measure for providing financial and economic support to water utilities in order to cover financial shortages and to cover new cost items incurred with the pandemic, such as cost for preventing infections or for cost for extra cost for arrears and bad payments. So I think that more details on these issues will be provided by the third session of this conference. I don't want to take more time, and I leave the floor to Maria for the first session on EU reforms. Thank you very much and good work.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you for your words of introduction that have set the scene indeed. So we'll start right away with the first session on reforming EU water legislation in the light of emerging challenges. So I think we're right into the topics that you've mentioned, Andrea. And so with us we have three panelists. So we have Neil Dodd, who's the Executive Director of AquaFed, which is the International Federation of Private Water Operators. We have also with us Milo Fiasconaro, who's the Executive Director of Acqua Pubblica Europea, which is the European Association of Public Water Operators. And we also have with us Luigi Del Giaco from Utilitalia, who's the head of the legal department of Utilitalia, which is the Italian Federation of the companies that are delivering public services in Italy. So thank you very much to all of you for being with us. So for this first session—
Sorry, Maria. Sorry, I'm not the head of legal. I'm a member of legal department.
Okay, sorry. You know, I saw you so big, you know, on top of the screen. So I apologize for your
Thank you very much.
Basically, you know, no offense. So thank you, nevertheless, to all of you for being with us this morning. So in order to have a sort of a conversation and to keep it going, I'm going to share my screen with two questions, and I will ask each of you, giving you the floor, obviously, to answer each of these two questions. So we'll start with the first question, and each of you giving us your answer, and then we'll start again another round with a second question. So I'll share my screen right away to put there I go, to put the questions. Okay, so the first question is about really the I mean, we were mentioning the fact that there is an ongoing reforming of some aspects of the EU water legislation. So the first question is really, what future application of the polluter pays principle and the cost recovery principle to address water and water supply and sanitation services emerging challenges? And among these emerging challenges, I've quoted in the question the decarbonation, you know, with this target of having a carbon neutral economy by 2050. There are also those emerging pollutants with the micropollutants, with the microplastic, with the endocrine disruptives that can be found in the wastewater. So what future application of the polluter pays principle and the cost recovery principles into that, let's say, broader context of emerging challenges? So if that's fine with you, I'll first ask Neil Dodd to answer the first question. Neil, if that's okay with you?
Hi, Maria, and hi, Stefan, as well. Thank you very much, both of you, for the invitation. I'll try and be as quick as I can. I haven't got any slides, so just a few points. I mean, Maria, actually, it's to be honest, I should be quiet and let you speak because you're much more experienced about the whole debate since your historical involvement with the CIS. So I should, but I'll try. Look, we know that EU water legislation has the double objective of protecting citizens and the environment. What we wanted to do at AquaFed is go upstream on policy, actually, and think a bit more about getting back to basics first. And you know, the human right to water and sanitation is what I refer to. There's still parts of Europe where access to water which is a parameter of the human right, isn't guaranteed. Just a silly example, but a good one, I think, that in Brussels, you can't sometimes get a free glass of tap water, which it is your human right, but they make you pay for it. So, and also Aquafed recently, we on the occasion of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, we called on the EU to enshrine the human right to sanitation into EU law as well, because I think it should be the kind of basic fundamental that should underpin everything else we're talking about in terms of polluter pays and cost recovery. So we think that's very important, and we hope others will sign up to that. Now, to face the new challenges, as you've asked, specifically emerging pollutants, there needs to be more balance, I think, and what private operators call for is a level playing field across the EU, so there's no unfair competition. I think what we're seeing is that there's too many kind of environmental free rides or market distortions, and polluters are paying more in one country and not in another, or sometimes not at all, actually. And in some cases, the polluted pay, which is even worse, quite honestly. And we've seen examples of that. So, so in terms of that, we think on an EU playing field. Conversely, on cost recovery, we feel that there should be a sovereign decision, but it has to be underpinned by transparency and uniform KPIs, so that public debates are kind of underpinned by sound, comparable data. This point about transparency, I'm going to really hammer this to death now, actually, because it's really fundamental for us. We promote really strongly mandatory transparency requirements. Users and stakeholders need to know what they're paying for in their tariff, how the tariff's constructed, and also where their money is being spent on. Now, Drinking Water Directive, yes, as Andrea said, it was an advance on that, but as far as we were concerned, it didn't go anywhere near as far as it could have done. And I think it's a missed opportunity. Just in terms of the tariff itself and how municipalities or public operators or municipalities use it, that is up to them, absolutely. And we're not opposed to the money from the tariff being used for other public services. I think that's the kind of the OECD 3 T's in action. It's fine. But again, municipalities need to be absolutely transparent to their users and the tariff payers where that money's gone. Just one last point. We have aging infrastructure in Europe. Everyone knows that. Plus, we have new challenges of emerging pollutants. Plus, we have decarbonisation to deal with. And we have impacts of climate change. And our infrastructure system isn't ready in Europe, I don't think, by any means or shape or form. What I think, going back to transparency, is that we almost have to force ourselves, whether we bind ourselves in legislation or regulatory requirements, to explain this to users, because we are going to have to take them on that journey as we renew this infrastructure. And we have to understand and have a depoliticized debate about things like tariffs, willingness to pay, service levels and investment. So we need, I think, independent regulators. I see a much more stronger role for them, in my humble opinion, rather than politicized debates. But I'll leave it there, Maria, but hopefully that was clear.
Thank you very much, Neil. So now I'll turn to Milo, if you want to take the floor for the first question, your views on the first question.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thanks really a lot for this invitation. Thanks to the Florence School of Regulation to this very interesting and timely webinar, for the reasons Mr. Guerini mentioned before. Polluter space principle. Well, as Acqua Pubblica, we definitely believe that we need to work for a more thorough and also more uniform application of the polluter space principle across Europe, for the reason that have been mentioned also by Neil. First, it's a matter of social equity to avoid that households, and in particularly more vulnerable households, pay for the pollution made by a few, and so also by basically subsidizing polluters. Therefore, it's also a matter, more specifically, to achieve a fairer distribution of the additional resources that are needed to address emerging pollutants. And it's also a matter of economic efficiency and of proper functioning of the internal market, for the reason mentioned by Neil, that is to avoid environmental dumping across Europe. But so what does it mean in concrete polluters pay? We often discuss about the problem of agriculture, and this is indeed maybe one of the major problems. Let me focus today more on the industrial dimension, and in particular on two issues. One is how we how we calculate the fee that industries have to pay for their pollution, first topic. And the second one, more briefly, on extended producer responsibility. So the first point, how we calculate the fee that industries have to pay for their pollution of water. Well, basically across Europe, I think we can identify two main models, two main approaches. One is basically based on the volumetric approach, on the load of wastewater that you discharge, of course, modeled based on the kind of industry you are, so the kind of pollution. The second system is actually a bit finer and a bit more precise, and it's going to look more precisely through sampling, through analysis of wastewater, on what kind of pollutants are concretely discharged and in which quantity. This second system, we believe, is much more appropriate, much more efficient. First, because the first one, the volumetric discharge, well, an industry could adopt measures to reduce the quantity while leaving unchanged, the quantity of discharged water while leaving unchanged actually the quantity of pollutants. And the second system is also more appropriate because it gives an incentive to those industries that are actually investing to adopt more environmentally friendly practice to reduce actual pollution. So the second system is much more efficient and much more equitable, we think, but to our knowledge is very rarely adopted in Europe. We find example in France, although not all France has this system. We find also example a bit less in Germany, maybe in Northern Europe, but that's it. So it's not a very diffuse system, and the reason is simple, because this second system, the system of looking at what kind of pollution is actually really created and discharged by industry is much more complex. It requires much more human resources to monitor and implement it. And so our message is simple on this. I mean, we believe that this second system should be applied more, but we need to invest on it. We need human resources. We need public resources to have a proper monitoring system of the pollution discharged, in particular by industry, also by agriculture. Someone is talking about having an environmental police. I don't know if it's a nice term or it sounds a bit scary. In any case, we need public resources to monitor the pollution. See, this is our first message. On EPR, extended producer responsibility. As you may know, the European Commission has tabled the EPR as a policy option in the framework of the revision of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, as a way to finance the additional treatment that is required to address emerging pollutants. The debate is going on. Euro, if Oliver allows me to make a bit of advertisement on Euro has published a very comprehensive study on the technical and also political conditions requirement to implement the EPR at the European level. There has been a conference a couple of weeks ago organized by the European Commission and the German presidency on this, also addressing this issue with very nice exchange also from colleagues from the OECD who cast some skepticism about the use of the EPR for emerging pollutants. Our position, in short, well, again, I invite you to consider Euro study because it's really well done. In short, we believe, sure, a European tax might be the most appropriate way to address emerging pollutants. But let's be honest, it's very, very unrealistic that we have European tax on this nowadays. EPR are more feasible, are also a lower hanging fruit, let's say. It's a quite mature approach. So we believe this could be a solution, again, to avoid that households, and particularly vulnerable households, bear the burden of all the significant additional investments are needed. Let me just make an additional consideration in EPR. If ever we are going to have an EPR for emerging pollutants, and in particular for pharmaceutical, we believe this should be ideally made at European level. So the money, the collection of the money and the distribution of the money should be at European level. And the reason is quite simple, because whereas the pollution generated by pharmaceutical is by definition diffuse, very, very diffuse, the industry that is producing it is very concentrated at special level. So if we want to avoid that a territory that has not pharmaceutical industry remain without access to this additional source of financing, well, then this must be at European level. And for those who believe the European Union could also be a context to carry out policies to fight the climate change additionally, and maybe in a more appropriate way than national government, the national level, well, then the EPR system will be a very nice opportunity to build this more environmental Europe, let's say. I stop here. I would like to, I have many other things to add, but I think I don't want to take time of the other speakers, but I hope that there will be time of question and replies to go a bit further on some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and absolutely, this is very rich, and I'm also refraining from starting asking questions because I mean, as you know, the Florence School of Regulation, the water area just expanded this year to include waste, municipal waste as well. So EPR is definitely a scheme that we know of, and we know all the let's say the power of that kind of scheme to incentivize and to manage efficiently. To some extent, some pollution issues. So, and I'll just, I'll just use my power of moderator just to say that when you were quoting the example of France, using this kind of sampling for industries, having worked in a water agency in France, in Seine-Normandy Water Agency, I know that actually industries, they really wanted to have their sample rather than just having this volumetric kind of thing, because as you mentioned, the industries that did invest in depollution, they wanted to be charged only on the pollution that they were generating. So they, it's like also, it's not only a sort of a command and control, it was really demanded and asked for by the industries themselves. So they are also pushing for that. So that was just a very, very short reaction. Now I'll move on to Luigi, last but not least, on the first question. And Luigi, if that's fine with you, I'll ask you to, when you're done answering the first question, move on to the second question that I'm going to be reading now, just before giving you the floor, so that then I will give the floor back to Milo and Neil to close those answers to the question. So the second question is on binding cross-references for an efficient combined implementation of the Water Framework Directive and the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. So Luigi, you have.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in this interesting event. So coming to the first question, it's a relevant question because talking about emerging challenges is equivalent to asking what is the future of water service. And just a little addiction. If decarbonation, along with emerging pollutants, represents the most immediate topic, the most political topics, effects of climate change probably represent the greatest challenge for the future. And in recent years, a steady decrease of water resources has already been reported in some area in the south of Europe, and we may assume that things are not going to get any better in the future. So during the next decades, therefore, it is important to increase investments to ensure resilience of a water system versus water scarcity. And combating climate change is an issue intimately linked to decarbonation, because the capacity of water system must be increased while minimizing the emissions. So it's a titanic challenge, and require extremely costly intervention. And it now is necessary to analyze the issue from two viewpoints. On one end, what can be done with the tools currently available? On the other hand, what additional tools can be implemented to guarantee the resources to water utilities? And it's also important to analyze these instruments in the light of the mentioned polluter pay and full cost recovery principles. With regard to the first issue, we know that in Europe we have different situations. And each member state has a regulated water services in its own particular way. And these choices have strongly influenced implementation of a full cost recovery and polluter pays principle. So we have different situations all across the Europe. And in some realities, the tariff, for example, ensure only a part of the resources. But in other countries, such as Italy, the tariff represent probably the only tool which the utility can rely on to collect the resources necessary to ensure a service compliant with the standards. And in Italy, thanks to a tariff method capable of correctly intercepting the needs of the sector, and we have to say thank you to the National Regulatory Authority, so ARERA. In recent years, in Italy, it has been possible to bring the entire sector out of a substantial stagnation, making it again attractive to investors. And for this reason, in future, at least in Italy, obviously, because this situation is typical of the Italian organization, the tariff is going to remain the primary leverage which sector has to rely on. But it's clear that in this historical period, the tariff leverage cannot be excessively stressed without the risk on inequality. So in the future, it's important to guarantee to the sector new forms of financing to ensure the realization of the investment necessary to face the emerging challenges. And in this sense, the resources made available by Next Generation EU will play an important role, at least that in the immediate future. And Next Generation EU represents an important tool, but it's unique, it's unrepeatable. So in the longer term, the sector needs new and alternative financing instruments like hydro bonds or in general sustainable finance, specifically dedicated to the future challenges, primarily the climate change and decarbonation. In this sense, the taxonomy regulation represents an important element, but it should be noted, however, that the delegated regulation currently under consultation may actually risk to be more of an obstacle than a promotional tool of sustainable finance. Thresholds are too challenging. The metrics used are difficult to apply. So we hope that the Commission will intervene to make the parameters and tool more reasonable, let me say. So with regard to emerging pollutants, we need a paradigm shift, as already said by Milo, especially in the application of polluter pays principle, continuing to adopt an end-of-pipe approach whereby wastewater treatment plants is responsible for removing the pollutants from water is not realistic, is unrealistic. It's necessary to move from an ex post to an ex ante approach, which encourage virtuous behavior, discourage the production and marketing of substances that impact on the water ecosystems, and transfer the burdens associated with the treatment of these substances and on those who actually have put them into the system. So I agree with Milo. In this sense, therefore, it's necessary to strongly focus at European level on EPR systems, especially for the most impacting substances. already successfully tested in another sector. So Maria, I can go to the second question. Okay.
Yeah, in a few minutes, please.
Okay, don't worry. We know that the current legislation on protecting aquatic ecosystems is a result of a long process. And in the past, the action of the European legislator was fragmented, aimed at solving specific punctual problems. But in recent years, after the adoption of the water framework directive, EU moved to an holistic approach, and already said by Andrea Guerrini, in the next few months, we will see a massive revision of the sectoral directives. And it will be important to push on an holistic approach, as already said. But at the moment, this approach clashes with the persistence of highly fragmented rules with directives and regulations that imply different goals, different objectives. So we know that the goal of all the rules adopted by the European legislator have the same goal, protection and water environment, protection of water environment from the impact of human activities. But the tools and the approaches are obviously different. Just an example, the concept of deterioration contained in the Water Framework Directive. As we know, Article 4 of the directive is a highly relevant provision in any procedure granting a permit for water use, including construction and operation of wastewater treatment plants. And the competent authority must not grant an authorization for water use if requirements are not met, unless the exception we know. On the other hand, as consequence, water utilities have to invest more time and more money if they need a new permit for discharge of wastewater, for example, treated wastewater, obviously. On the other hand, the deterioration clause protects the water resources uses for drinking purpose, for example. And this is true with other activities like power plants, hydropower plants, infrastructure, protection of the other infrastructures and other water uses. But it's clear that the water service is the most impacted and wastewater treatment above all. And ultimately, therefore, this tool provided by Water Framework Directive is certainly important, useful, but it's unreasoned and excessively restrictive application risk to limiting the possibility of building, for example, networks or plants. So, as we know, wastewater treatment, I'm focusing on the construction of wastewater treatment plants. Unlike most other economic activities, is not a totally free activity, as the location of plants is strongly bound to precise requirements, including geographical, orographic ones. So the introduction of excessively rigid and restrictive constraints and limits risk being counterproductive, as it limits the possible location of plants with possible rejection of authorization for their construction, or makes the management of this service too burdensome. It's necessary so to adopt a balanced and, I repeat, an holistic approach, able to intercept all needs, environmental, economic, and operational. Only in this way is possible to build a truly effective European regulatory framework capable of protecting all aquatic ecosystems.
So Luigi, I'll have to stop you there, because I know it's a very large and broad subject. Well, thank you very much. I'll move to Milo, and I have to say that Acqua Pubblica Europea has produced a report really on this topic of an efficient combined implementation of the WFD and the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. So Milo, I'm really eager to have your answer following what Luigi just said about changing, you know, the paradigm but still having this holistic approach.
Thanks, thanks, Maria. I was about to say indeed for this second question that I wanted to quote ourselves, but you anticipated me, and I am very happy to hear that this report is, known. Indeed, actually, it was the result of the seminar that we organized back in March this year. Probably was the last live, one of the last live seminars that were organized in Brussels on the combined implementation of the two directives. Of urban wastewater and water framework directive, based through an analysis of concrete cases coming from operators throughout Europe. The report is quite dense, I would say. I will invite even more you to have a look at the report, because I could also try some of the conclusion now, or simplify some of them. There are issues that have been mentioned also by Luigi. I just focus on one thing. Our conclusion, the main conclusion of that exchange would be like this: that we don't think that there is really a problem of coherence between the urban wastewater and the water framework directive. In any case, we cannot say it. You cannot say that there is incoherence, because otherwise the Commission is not happy. Let's say that there is an issue of synchronization between the two directives. And in particular, I would like to emphasize the issue of smaller agglomeration and rural areas, because what we say is that the wastewater treatment effort, especially in rural areas, needs to be adapted. It needs to be modeled on the quality of the recipient body. Otherwise, you risk. So it must be calculated. The effort on wastewater treatment must be model about on a river basin basis. Otherwise, you risk to have not enough treatment in one point, say downstream, or otherwise excessive treatment upstream. And overall, you risk to have a treatment effort that is ineffective and inefficient in relation to the objective of the Water Framework Directive. So really, the invitation is that for environmental reason, but also for economic reason, I will come back to this in a second, we believe that it's really, we believe it's important to move really towards a more integrated approach at the river and basin level in the management of water resources, or at least, if not a river and basin, at least a regional scale, which also involves for water operators the issue of increasing the perimeter of operation. I mean, to reduce fragmentation of water utilities, we need to move towards more regional operators, operating in a regional scale. The new drinking water directive is pushing in the right direction, we think, on this, because through the risk-based approach, through new obligation on upstream monitoring on the quality of water, is actually pushing towards this more integrated approach. And we hope that also the new urban wastewater treatment directive will move in the right direction, in the same direction, downstream, to create a more direct link between the WFD and the urban wastewater treatment directive. This is for environmental reasons, but also for economic reason, because we think it's already the case now, and will be even more so in the future with the new urban wastewater treatment directive. The cost per person of urban wastewater operation is higher for a series of reasons in rural areas as compared to urban areas. And again, this will be even more so with the new urban wastewater treatment directive. So if we having a regional scale of operation, having regional operators, we believe is also a way to equalize a bit the costs between the urban environment and rural environment. And this makes sense because water resources indeed have a regional scale, have a river basin approach. So for a matter of environmental efficiency, but also social efficiency and equity, we need to take this in a more regional, at a more regional scale. let me also add quickly that I joined definitely Luigi comments on the taxonomy and the delegated act. We are really concerned about the indicators that have been put forward so far in the draft delegated acts, which will, if they stay like this, will actually prevent investment will reduce the investment flow to the water sector, and this because there is a fundamental misconception in this taxonomy. I mean, at least for the water operation, that water operators are considered like an industrial sector like anyone else. No, water operators are providing environmental services. Of course, there is a need to improve efficiency. Of course, there is the need to do right investments. But you can, I mean, basically all investment in the water sector are helping to address environmental challenges. So we really invite everyone who is listening to take this into consideration and to do all the advocacy activity that is needed to raise Commission awareness of some basic mistake they've made in the delegated act. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Milo. Neil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. And I think it's quite scary that what I'm about to say is pretty much exactly what Milo just said. So I think he said it much better than I have, actually. Have the two pieces of legislation complemented each other? Yes, I think they have. We think they have. On pretty much all matters, actually, spatially, financially, process-wise. Milo mentioned the word coherence. I think that's absolutely correct, actually. Municipalities now, I mean, the way we are now with the position of these two pieces of legislation is that municipalities do have a much stronger handle, or at least they're able to have a much stronger handle on decisions at basin level. So we know that urban wastewater treatment directive has been a stimulus for a lot of investment, and it has helped preserve EU resources. Basin finance, it kind of sits at tariff level as well. It sits on the bill, and municipalities are responsible for that, and that's good, a very good thing. Municipalities have the kind of the democratic mandate for their area as well. It was interesting what Milo was talking about, kind of regional operators. I haven't had a chance to think that through yet, but that's quite interesting. One for another day, I think. And I think that the territorial kind of footprint of the municipalities is paramount. They cover, as Milo I think said, urban and rural areas. They cover biodiversity spots, wetlands, which are all at stake, right? So I think that it's in a good place. And also, you know, there's been a lot of coherence between Water Framework Directive, Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and now the Drinking Water Directive as well. But it can be strengthened. And like what we're seeing with the Drinking Water Directive, with the water safety plans, and again, I think Milo mentioned this, and this kind of this call for tighter controls on upstream pollution, I think that's very, very important. Likewise, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, we're hoping that we'll be able to tackle pollution hotspots with these kind of emerging concerns a lot more. So to be honest, I think Milo's articulated very well, and I think the points have been made. I'm also going to make a kind of a nice plug for Oliver in the next round. I also thought that the Euro's comments on their fork to farm strategy were actually, a lot of it was quite relevant here and very interesting, and they really kind of set out some of the legislative changes that are required. But that's for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll take just 5 minutes, because then I know that Stefan will be angry at me, you know, for not managing properly the time, which is definitely something that I have trouble to do. But I'll take just 5 minutes for a quick question related to EPR and to the way that those emerging pollutants can be, I mean, the investments necessary to address those emerging pollutants can be financed, because I've you know I've just like everybody, I guess, I looked at what Switzerland is doing and has decided to do with regard to micropollutants and investing on the already existing wastewater treatment plants and upgrading them so that they can treat they should be able to treat 80% of the micropollutants. And being an economist, of course, I'm looking at the way the whole thing is being financed, and basically it's being financed through a tax that's going to be levied from the people, so from the Swiss people. This tax is going to be temporary just being levied to finance those investments. So this is, I mean, being French, this is something that never happens. A tax that disappears, once you don't need the funding anymore. I mean, in France, it doesn't happen because the income tax was created to finance the First World War, in France, and we still pay it. So, but basically they are levying a tax on the people. So, I mean, they're the polluter pays principle. I'm a bit puzzled because because I can't really see the link between the tax levied on the people and the polluter pays principle for those specific micropollutants. And this, I mean, this links to the European tax that Milo was mentioning. I mean, if you want people to be unhappy about Europe, and they're doing really a silly comment from my perspective, but if you want people to be unhappy about Europe, you just put on a tax, and having this tax not being paid by those who generate the pollution. And so what are your views on the way to finance specifically the, let's say, microplastic or endocrine disruptive pollution? Because I'm quite seduced by the EPR schemes to finance that kind of new investment and those specific ones, rather than a tax that would be levied on people. Who wants to take the floor? Just throw your ideas in, and unmute yourself first, and then throw your ideas in.
Maybe I go first. Maria, can I go?
Sure.
Yeah, but maybe just to add that indeed, one of our members of Acqua Pubblica is the operator of Geneva. So we were really interested in knowing a bit more from their experiences, what they've done to address, in particular, pharmaceuticals with quaternary treatment, how they the cost is distributed. And indeed, is precisely what you said. And we were raising with this person, with the director of a water operator in Geneva, some issue about the fact that actually they decided that basically is the cost of additional treatment is supported by users, by final users. But the response of Gerard, this person, is about, well, of course, it's a political decision. And then he added a quote from, let me say, from Coluche, and I will try to translate it from French to English, none of my mother language. He say, in Switzerland, there are no poors. If they are poors, are not Swiss. It's a joke, but to say that it's a political decision. And if you ask, so you cannot depoliticize. Maybe we can have an exchange with Neil on this, also in another occasion, completely this decision, which is about the distribution of the cost across population, across social group, and across territories. It's a political decision. Let's have a political discussion on this. I mean, if you believe, like in Switzerland, that it's a fair way in any case, it's a more efficient to put all the burden on households. But let's do that. But at least in European perspective, as a very, very good study by the OECD and European Commission on investment needs in Europe showed very clearly, well, there are affordability issues in different countries. And in different countries, the room for increasing tariffs is limited without impacting even further on affordability. So we believe that it's fair, but also insist for a matter of economic efficiency to put the burden also a bit more on the polluters. It's enshrined in the treaty. It makes economic sense. Then let's discuss what are the best way to do so, what are the pros and the cons. I mean, let me also say, of course, that EPI in any case is not a panacea. I mean, we believe that it can work for example, for pharmaceuticals. More complicated, it's much more complicated for microplastic. Also, because microplastic is by definition we don't know very much about the source and how to track down the source. Let me add just one thing, which is catching up with something we said before, and what you were saying about taxes. Well, there are, of course, also personal or political consideration on this, as we were saying. Let me add a very additional example from France that we believe is very good. Municipalities have the chance, not the obligation, to put an additional small tax on top of the fee for wastewater treatment on industrial pollution. And this tax is not going to finance wastewater treatment operation, but is going to finance intervention on biodiversity restoration, on protection of catchment area, and so on. So things that are considered as a public good, basically, that everybody benefits from. And they think that the tax is the most appropriate way to finance this environmental good. It's food for thought, I think. And I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. Do you wanna react?
No, again, I think it's some good points by Milo. I think on this question of a tax, for example, I mean, this is a very personal view rather than Aquafed's, but what I see generally is, you could, tax is possible, but what I would like to see is a much more educated public, and by that I mean much more awareness of what the problems really are, because I don't think even investors really understand. Investors, I'm talking about private capital, really fully understand the nature of these challenges, and therefore they haven't been told enough about what it is they're being asked to invest in, and different ways of making a return, because investors do need to make a return, right? But so that we're still struggling with that. But also local people and buying in. If we're going to tax people, can we convert that directly into some sort of financial mechanism? Like Luigi was talking about hydro bonds, for example, and I agree with that. We need to be much more braver, but also in a way that people are comfortable with. And I also understand as well that at the other end of the spectrum, there is this risk that people will say about the financialization of water. It's a very tricky balance, and I do understand those concerns as well. I don't always agree with it, but I do always understand it. We've got examples across Europe now, or I'm talking about England because we're still just about in Europe for a few more days. But we've seen with the English and Welsh system that a lot of money can be raised very, very quickly. That system on its own, it's got its problems as well. But there are models out there that can be used. But like I said, it's really about, for me, it's fundamentally about people, the public, being bought in and understanding what it is they're being asked to pay for.
Thank you. Luigi, do you wanna step in and react?
No, just to say that I partially agree with the other panelists. I think that the taxation cannot be an efficient solution. It's difficult to intercept the real needs of the system through taxation. So I think that the tariff must remain at the center of all mechanisms that we can imagine. European taxation, it could be an interesting way an interesting solution, but I think it's a political question, a political topic, and it's very hard to find, what can I say, to find a current solution all around, for all the member states. So I think it's very hardly applicable.
Thank you very much. I'll have to close this session, although we could have gone on the discussion for quite a long time, but that's good. It's food for thought for 2021. So I want to thank you all three of you for your inputs and very interesting food for thoughts. Thank you very much. I'll move on to Stefan because I'm a little bit late, but I think we did damage control time-wise. I think we're good. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Maria. So let's move to the second session of our meeting. That would be about the role of regulators. So we already discussed a little bit about the role of regulators, obviously, especially when we are talking about more transparency and the need to depoliticize the water price. So we will continue on the same vein, and we will focus on the role of regulators to incentivize innovation and digitalization of water supply and sanitation services. We've got 3 speakers to open the discussion. On the one side, we've got Alan Sutherland. So you are a chief executive at the Water Industry Commission for Scotland, WICS, since its creation in 2005. And I read in your short bio on the web that you prefer the approach to regulation that is to avoid the confrontation with company and to implement ethical business, ethical practices, ethical regulations that would rely on trust and collaboration. So I'm very interested by this way of doing, and I don't know if we'll talk about it, especially for this session, but I hope so. The second speaker will be Itai Sag. I'm not sure this is exactly like this. We should say okay. Your name. It's okay. Sorry. So you are coming from the Israel Water Authority. That is also a young institution because it has been established in 2007, if I'm right. And it will be interesting, of course, to have your 2 points of view. On the one side, Alan Sutherland and Itai Sag from 2 different institutions. And the discussion will be opened by Olivier Lobel from EURO. EURO, that is the European Federation of National Associations of Water Services. And if I am right, EURO is representing national drinking and wastewater services for nearly 30 countries around the world, from both private and public sectors. So this is interesting to have Olivier to react about the 2 presentations that will be made. So Alan, you are the first speaker. The floor is yours for 10 minutes. And you need to unmute your mic before to start and to share your screen.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Excellent. So thank you for the invitation. It's always interesting to hear the perspectives of people, particularly on new legislation and all of that. From our standpoint, we've just completed our price review. So as of last week, we've set prices for the water industry in Scotland, or set charge levels, maximum charge levels for the next 6 years. And in doing so, we had to start with a whole series of quite new challenges, at least for us, in terms of what we were thinking about. So the 2 real challenges that we started off this regulatory period and having to think about were, one, how are we going to allow for asset replacement to be done in a timely way, in a way that was consistent with achieving net zero emissions, and how are we going to do it in a way that took full advantage of whatever innovation might appear over time. And I think our sort of short answer was, we can't just kick the can down the road, we've got to begin to try and address it. And the second I've already sort of mentioned in passing in the first, which is that the Scottish Government gave Scottish Water a target. We like to think a much more difficult target than our cousins south of the border, but a target to reach net zero emissions on an operational and embodied carbon basis across the entire installed asset base by 2040. So how did we go about thinking about this? Well, I think the first thing we tried to do was to say, what was it that had been successful in terms of regulation? And what we identified essentially was that regulation has worked essentially by limiting the amount of money that is available to deliver a specified set of outcomes to I guess regulated utilities in general, but in our case specifically the water industry. And that really has resulted in some huge improvements in cost effectiveness, particularly in the operational side. Also in terms of the procurement of capital projects. Now, whether or not it has been quite so effective in terms of ensuring that investments are made in a timely way, I think is is an open question, and one that I think probably on balance, I think now there might have been some issues with. So we think that regulation has been very effective in terms of delivering real benefits for customers, but we also think that it needs now to change and to move away from just being about, in essence, a reputational incentive to perform. What do I mean by that? I mean essentially that, and it's an open question to others, I can't think of a situation where a regulated utility is seen to have performed well and its regulator has been seen not to be effective, and vice versa. But somebody give me an example, then I'd be really interested to understand what was going on. So we had, in trying to think about this and trying to think about how we were going to enable a transition to net zero by 2040 and how we were going to get to a position where we are able to get the assets replaced in a timely way. There were two things that we thought we needed to do. And they're probably quite closely related, but they're quite material moves away from the rigors of the hard budget constraint that was at the core of our previous approach. The first is that we've established a very material allowance, well over £130 million over the period. And that is simply there in an event that Scottish Water adopts solutions which are better on NPV terms, but maybe use more cash. And by better, I mean they are now costing benefits and taking account of costs such as carbon costs, which might change the basic finances of what would have been the incentive with the hard budget constraint. So we're explicitly trying to get to the best economic answer in the round, taking account of all externalities. And then the second is that instead of going down the route of funds for innovation, discrete funds, we thought it rather better that we get into a position where it is simply accepted that innovation should be part of the day job. And that Scottish Water should be asked to seek out innovative solutions. And of course, the corollary of that is that there has to be an explicit recognition that not all innovation will be successful. So it's really a question about how do we try and do that. So in order to try and make that work, we thought that two things become really critical. And this is going back to the question of ethical business regulation. First is that we see a real need for genuine ownership of its strategy by the regulated business, in our case by Scottish Water. So no more hiding behind the economic regulator, no more saying we're not funded to do this. The issue now is the regulated business has to get on and deliver and explain why it is doing things. And then what goes with that is that there has to be a new level of openness and discussion. We've got to get away from, or at least in our view, and I think we have done reasonably well so far, got away from a game of sort of regulatory ping pong where we get a business plan, we say it's not good enough, they say we've got it flawed, and move towards something that's a much more open level of dialogue about what needs doing, why it needs doing, what the case for making for action is, and actually having that discussion in a much more collaborative sort of a way. Frankly, for doing this, I think I've learned a huge amount about behaviours within the regulated business, which I could have done what I was doing for a very long time and never have learned before. So it's quite interesting to understand those economics. And that really takes us to this question, which frames our approach for these long-term challenges, which is really a question of building a bridge between the two sides, regulator and regulated, in order to actually have a much more real discussion about long-term asset management, about how we can create incentives that are going to be effective, about what the real catalysts for change might be and what the difficulties might be. So it's a completely different approach. Obviously, it's rather early to say whether it's going to work, but as I said, the signs are rather promising that we're seeing a very different approach from the regulated entity at this point than we would have done in previous price review cycles. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe that you stress very interesting point, especially from an economic point of view. We know as economists that in order to give right incentives to reduce costs, you need to think about price cap for a regulated period, as you said. But as soon as you decide about this, I mean, you've got some. It's not easy to encourage investment and to cope with future challenge linked to innovation, as you said. So a more open dialogue, more transparency, maybe more transparency also for regulators and companies to be accountable in front of stakeholders, to have all the data available for everybody. So thank you very much for this presentation. Let's move to the second presentation that will be made by Itai Sag, just to see if your point of view is your point of views are converging or not.
Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation. Just load the presentation. Okay, so probably you all know that Israel is most of the country area is a desert. It's a very scarce area, so water is a very important resource. So you can see our water consumption in Israel by sector, and you can see that more than half of it goes to agriculture. So in order to prevent our water resources not used properly, we have to make sure that we reuse most of our water. So that's a very great engine for our economic. We have a very balance we have to keep between the water demand and the water resources, so that we make sure that we don't use most of our resources, and in order to prevent from making new ones by desalination plants, we have to use some of it as effluents for agriculture and other uses. So basically, the Israel Water Authority has an agenda for governance and regulation principle, and these three major are for regulations. So we have to make sure that we have only one. Sorry, I'm a bit excited, so you might not understand my English. We have a regulation point of view. So we have a council that decides all the main interventions. We have to make sure that the finance regarding the water tariff, which concern for water services and sewage services. And of course, we have the service standards that we have to make sure that all of our water utilities or water corporation work by these standards. And just to make sure that we understand that around 2010, the state of Israel decided that the water sector was not held properly by the municipalities. So they held a law, meaning that all the water and sewer sector will be worked by corporations, municipal corporations, which are our main purpose is just to make sure that all our citizens get sufficient water supply and sanitation. And you can see that before and after this reform of new utilities were made, you can see the differences in investments in water and sewer infrastructure. You can see the differences in a few municipalities. In addition, one of our major concern is non-revenue water improvement. You can also see the differences between the two periods before the corporation establishment and after, you can see also. And this is for non-water revenue improvement overall the country. And one of the main projects that the Israel Water Authority made was to establish engineering standards. And this means that we have to make sure that our water provider or water corporation make sure they have sufficient water supply and sanitation for all users. That means they have to have master planned, renovated, making sure that they have a program for non-revenue water reduction, and of course infrastructure investment for new and renewable and upgrading those infrastructure. And for the main question, the role of regulators to incentive innovation and digitalization of water supply and sanitation, these engineering standards, making sure that all those corporations have to use new technologies in order to stand in those engineering standards. So I want to present just two interesting technology. One is concerned for water leakage detection, which means that you have to install detectors over fire hydrants or other water infrastructure, and it has a detector that goes to a system where you can see all the leakage in your pipes. They can map it and use GIS systems, and in that way the management can decide what pipelines they have to replace and forecast their investment. And another interesting technology is based on satellite modeling, which basically means that an area you can see on the left side, you can see a satellite preview of a city in Israel, where the model can tell you where are suspected points for sewer leakage, and then the corporation has to send some other technologies in order to find if that is really the situation, using CCTV or GPR. And of course, after modeling the area, you can of course excavate and replace the pipelines. And if to sum up, the principle and goals of the water sector as part of the Water Authority is to integrate the water resources management through technological and efficient solutions. Of course, the suppliers has to make sure they develop their infrastructure, making sure they are efficient, and that the consumers has to have water supply in a valuable commodity. And of course, the tariff, which combines water and sewer tariffs, supposed to co-op with all the sector needs for investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Itai, for your presentation. I propose to move to the discussion part of this second session. Olivier is already there. So Olivier, I don't want, if you want to start, I was just thinking, listening to the two speakers and especially Itai, that there is a need for regulation to keep prices acceptable and linked to the cost, and this is quite obvious, and maybe this is quite a short-term view. I don't know, but we could discuss about this. There is also a need for investment in the infrastructures, and we already discussed about this, the fact that we know that in many countries, we need to invest a lot within infrastructures in order to reduce the rate of leakages and so on. And there is also a need for investment to innovate and digitalize water services. So as a regulator, you might think about imposing things and make it mandatory. And it will be translated into the price paid by the consumer probably. But you might also maybe think about, and I don't know, I'm just putting this on the table, thinking about outcome-based regulation that would be based on social impact, if you're able to value or to measure social impact, or based on the economic value of the decisions that are decided by the private operator or by the operators that are not obviously always private. I don't know, but I believe the question is hard to answer. Olivier, are you ready to discuss and to open the discussion?
Yes, I am, and sorry for the difficulties in finding the right link to the meeting. I think it was, we heard two very interesting statements, and both Alan and Itai highlighted the need for regulators and operators to work closely together. I think that's a very important point. And also the need to have a long-term vision, which doesn't stop next year, but which goes to 2030, 2050. And I believe that 2050 or the Green Deal with its long-term vision is a good tool to understand that. When we look at that vision, of course, for me, again, this whole term of smart water should not be limited to what we call water services, and it should also include the whole way society functions and have a direct or indirect impact on the quality of drinking water resources, but also quality of wastewater. So for me, it would be interesting to know also for the regulators how you see your role in ensuring that this term of smart water, of protection of water resources goes beyond just the work that water operators do, but includes pollution we receive from industry, from agriculture and other sources, and which lead to additional costs also for our members, and eat up money that we could better use elsewhere, like, for example, for reducing leakage rates or so. So this would be an important point for me to clarify, and perhaps I can have your input on that.
Right now, you want them to react? Alan, do you have Alan or Itai? I don't know.
Yes, I can say that the Israel Water Authority has a very new water lab, specially designed for locating pollutions. And we constantly monitoring all our water resources. We have, I think, around 1,000 boreholes just for monitoring every once in a while the water quality and, of course, pollutions, and identifying some pollutions that are not usually identified in other regular labs. So concerning this, concerning your question, I hope you get an answer.
Thank you.
Alan, would you like to react?
Yeah, sure. I think from the standpoint of an economic regulator, I think there's a very clear line that we cannot cross, which is that we should remember that we are not the people who are operating the business or making the decisions. So what we are trying to do is create a set of conditions whereby the water industry will take the right decisions in consultation with its customers, but also with the communities with which it works, in order that genuine long-term approaches are adopted rather than those that could result from setting an allowed amount of money for a 4, 5, 6 year period, whatever it might be. And really with that focus on the long term, then we're hopeful that we get to a different type of discussion. So I don't think we're really sort of mandating a particular standard or a particular way of doing things. We're just sort of trying to create conditions that will allow them as the regulated entity to get there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. I mean, when I look, and you have a good example in Scotland, actually, Ellen, with Scottish Water, who are, I think, one of the first operators in Europe to have set out really a vision until 2030 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to look at all steps, all processes, including the assets they manage. So the embodied impacts in the assets they put in the ground, for example. I think this is really, really interesting work that's going on there. So, and that's also one of our tasks as Euro to ensure that others know about it also. One point, of course, that is highlighted in the Water Framework Directive, a point that came up today also, is financing, very important. I mean, there is no implementation of innovative solutions without proper financing. There is no way in, let's say, pushing tariffs beyond the level that is acceptable to society and also to vulnerable groups in society. So cost recovery is for us a very, very important part in the whole formula. And we have discussed it in the first session today, who should cover the cost, and then the polluter pays principle comes in. So for me, again, the challenge of ensuring that utilities have a long-term or can have a long-term financial stability, which allows them not only to maintain assets, and already this is a challenge in many countries, but also to improve them, to implement innovative services. This remains really a key to many of us. And for me, again, perhaps you can tell me how you resolve that in your country. How can we ensure that all utilities across Europe have stable financing through cost recovery? And this must also include, of course, money through others than the water consumers. So agriculture, industry who pollute water resources, so the polluter pays principle should be part of that formula. So how are you addressing that in your countries, and what would be your advice also to other countries to ensure that cost recovery is ensured?
Alan, would you like to react?
Sure. I think this is one of the most fundamental and most difficult questions that faces any economic regulator, and probably any regulated utility. One of the things that through the much improved and much more open dialogue that we've learned with Scottish Water has been what the implications of living within a defined budget were. So in essence, the approach to managing assets was one of managing risks and finding temporary, essentially temporary fixes that could avoid the need for significant commitment of resources, given that they were as limited as they were. So the way that we've gone about that is to have a much more open dialogue, not just between us and the regulated company, but involving government, involving the environmental and the water quality regulators and customers, about what is the nature of the asset base that Scottish Water is currently managing, breaking that up and having a look at what bits of that do we maybe need in perpetuity, and how do we ensure that those bits stay fit for purpose, that we do need in perpetuity. And then those bits that ultimately are at some point going to be replaced in full, What will the likely optimized replacement cost be based on our best information, and when do we think that's going to happen? So the combination of that has allowed us to understand what we might term an economic depreciation level as opposed to an accounting depreciation level for the assets. And I think the quite shocking thing from a Scottish perspective was that we felt like we were asking current generations of customers for rather less than their fair share, and putting an unfair burden on future customers. And so we've collectively made the policy decision that we need to transition from where we are to where we need to be. And in essence, that's going to mean around an increase of about 250 to 300% in the levels of replacement investment that will ultimately be needed from current levels, and obviously will need to be funded in charge levels.
Itai, would you want to react or?
Yes, please, Oliver. Can you please focus your question again?
Yeah. So what was the question? It was. Good. No,
I can answer in general from what I remember. That I'll say that in Israel the tariff is set for all the country. I mean that. Yeah. Each consumer.
So it was about cost recovery. So how do you ensure long-term financing to implement innovative solutions in addition to what you have already to do to maintain your assets, and while maintaining also affordability of the water services? This very tricky formula, how to finance water services in the long term, facing or responding to all the new challenges we have. Yeah.
So we also regulate, in addition to the engineering aspect, we also regulate the finance aspects of each utility. That means that the tariffs are set 2 times a year concerning the investment each utility has to make in the future. It's all been taken care in consideration. Of course, each utility has to come up with a business plan, a 5-year business plan, in order to see the development in the near future, and it is all based on the development of the municipal area. I mean, if a new neighborhood or a new commerce area is supposed to be developed, it's all been taken care of because the utilities also charge fees for infrastructure development. So there's a mechanism for income for new investment. And of course, concerning the socio and economical situation in each settlement or a municipality, the country also help or give different funds for specific infrastructure. If a new wastewater treatment plant is supposed to be established, it's a massive investment, CapEx and OpEx for each utility. So depending on the stability of the municipality and the utility, the country provides assistance concerning the finance. And in addition, of course, each utility has to come up with a master plan for water supply and sanitation, and this master plan is designed for the far future. It's supposed to be until 2040 and also for 2050. So we have a wide perspective of future investment concerning infrastructure and facilities, and so.
Okay. Thank you very much. Oliver, do you have a very last question, or because we are running out of time?
Okay, I asked a very short question. Digitalization is, of course, key. I mean, many of our members are working on that. The problem that comes with it is cybersecurity, and we know that the European rules are also being rewritten. We will see a new proposal tomorrow from the Commission. How are you ensuring cybersecurity in the digital age? And I think here Israel is perhaps ahead of other countries, so your experience would certainly be valuable in this context.
Part of our standards are making sure that all utility has to cope with the ISO standards. One of them is I think it's 24007 or something. I'm not sure what the name is, but it concerns cyber protection, and there are all sorts of others. And so we have to make sure, and of course, we make sure that they all use a digitalization infrastructure concerning GIS or other control systems. It's part of their engineering standards, and by that we make sure that they have to use new technologies and not just stay in the path where we set the levels or the roughs, and they have to cope with the new technologies.
So thank you very much, Alan, Itai, and Oliver for this session. As you know, Maria ran out of time during the first session, so now she's pressuring me. You can't see that, but in the conversation part of Zoom, for me to stop right now the second session. So thanks again, and let's move to the last and third session that will be organized as usual by Maria.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you, and it's true. I'm pressuring Stefan, for him to unfortunately wrap up this session too. That was very interesting indeed. But time management is sometimes difficult and cruel at the same time. So this is session 3 that we are starting. Session 3 on addressing climate change and pandemic impacts on water supply and sanitation services. And we'll have sort of two parts in this session. The first one, well, we'll try to answer, or at least to share some experience to answer the following question: how to build water supply and sanitation services resilient to water risks and a pandemic crisis. And in order to help you try to contemplate some answers to that question, we have with us Ivailo Koliev from the World Bank, and also Heather Smith from the University of Cranfield. And in the second part of this session, where we'll be focusing on achieving water security in urban water services, and we'll do that through an international review of experiences. Then we'll have Robert Breers with us from our Future Water. But I'll first turn to Ivailo Koliev. So the floor is yours, Ivailo, if you want to share your screen.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thanks first for the invitation, and while sharing my screen, because I have a few slides to present, I just want to say that I will be expressing my own view, because I cannot talk on the behalf of the bank. So let me just start a bit positive and say that over the past couple of years, we have seen significant world progress on human capital. And human capital, as you might be aware, is one of the new indicators that the World Bank is monitoring. And this has to do with the knowledge, skills, and health that people are investing in and accumulating during their lives, so that they can be, more productive and, of course, contribute to the society in general. So you can see in here, indicators around poverty, adult literacy rate, infant mortality, and etc. They were going up and improving. However, there came the COVID, and as you mentioned, it put a lot of stress on all the systems, not just the water supply and sanitation sector. Now, our assessment is that both the natural and human capital would likely to be in decline. We have not done an extensive analysis, but we did the rapid one in Romania. And as you can see in the graph, unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, the poorest people are affected the most by the virus and the overall pandemic situation, and as a result, the economic implications. Now, even before the COVID virus, the water in general was under a crisis. I would put it this way, because we have been talking this morning about pollutants, droughts, floods, and etc. So climate change is actually affecting us much more earlier than predicted, and of course our water supply and sanitation sector is not working in isolation. So all these extreme events that we are witnessing and unfortunately about to be witnessed more and more often are affecting the water supply and sanitation sector. Now, 5 years ago, the World Bank has started to change in its engagement, not only in Europe, but also across the world, from investing in infrastructure and helping clients build such infrastructure. We actually transitioned through more work on capacity building, blending finance and leveraging the World Bank money. And these days, more and more, we are focused on institutional changes, reforms in water supply and sanitation sectors. And as you mentioned, trying to build sustainability and resilience rather than focusing on a specific issue or a specific need. Why is that? I think it's quite obvious to all of us, but even more now with the COVID situation, that the pressure is not really that much on infrastructure, although there is some innovations going on, so that we can capture the virus and see in the wastewater and be able to react a bit earlier. But the pressure is much more on actually the sectors, how they are financed, regulated, how the services are delivered. So all this pressure is telling us that unless you fix the institutions, simply by fixing the pipes, you won't go much further, and it won't be helping on the long term. So we are focused quite a lot these days on building better through building greener and be more environmental in what we are financing, focusing on smaller and innovative solutions rather than building like in the past a huge wastewater treatment plant that if not properly managed, after a couple of years it's not providing the initially designed result. And then developing resilient water sectors, focusing on the required reforms, as I mentioned, and providing support to governments to address the climate changes and finance adaptation and mitigation measures. But again, through improving the governance, because even if you have significant investments in the water sector and in the water supply and sanitation sector, unless you ensure a proper tariff mechanism, as mentioned before, a proper regulation, as discussed in the second section, we cannot ensure that these investments and the sector overall, as well as the services, will be sustainable. And I just wanted to mention that in Europe these days, and we have worked with Maria in Romania, we're helping a couple of governments, member states actually, to focus on compliance issues. In Romania, we have managed to help the government to create a new implementation plan for the urban wastewater treatment directive. So this is something to be approved by the government and shared with the Commission. We're also working to create river-based management plans and flood risk management plans. So we're working and providing advisory services. We're not shying away from infrastructure investments, but for example, if we are to finance in an infrastructure that the Commission is not really financing, let's say a dam, we would not finance just a dam here or there, unless it cope with an improvement of the overall management of the water sector in this specific country, focused on integrated water resource management, and really, guaranteeing that once it is created, there will be an agency or somebody properly operating and maintaining this dam or whatever infrastructure it is, so that it's provided the designed outputs. So let me stop here and back to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Ivailo, for your presentation. And indeed, we were talking about changing paradigm and having an holistic approach in the first session, and I'm feeling this is also like the evolvement, part of the evolvement, obviously, of the World Bank views and perspective on those investments with the more holistic approach. I'll turn now to Heather Smith. Heather, you have the floor if you want to share some slides and your screen.
Oh yeah, thanks. I'll just get my screen going. Right, hopefully you can see that okay?
Absolutely.
Good, okay, well I'll try and go relatively quickly because I'm picking up on a lot of points that have been addressed before, and so I've called this a UK perspective, but actually with all due respect to Alan, this is more of an England and Wales perspective since Alan has already presented about Scotland. So I guess if I started on a bit of a positive note, I'm starting on more of a downer. The sort of title we were given was to look at some of the how to build resilient services in the face of the pandemic, and the pandemic has obviously catalyzed a lot of action and a lot of interest into overall resilience, but it has, I suppose, in some ways, understandably, distracted from some of these future changes that we are still facing, and which could compound on each other. So just to start with, I'll go through quickly some of the impacts that we have seen in the water sector here from the pandemic. And obviously one of the biggest influences has been in kind of immediate demand, and we've not seen much change in overall demand, but that's partly because there's been, due to home working and everything, there's been a rise in household consumption that was largely offset by a drop in non-household consumption as a result of lockdowns. So early on, that largely balanced each other out. It's starting to come back a little bit now, I suppose, the other direction, but most of the water companies seem to think that a lot of that rise in household consumption will likely be permanent, or certainly long lasting anyway. And in addition to that, we've seen sort of significant shifts in just daily demand patterns. These are now, the day-to-day usages have changed. This is more strongly correlated to weather now. So a lot of the models that had been used to predict and manage daily demand in the network were largely thrown out the window early on. And there were issues with having to try and maintain pressure and service in the networks to adjust for these different demand patterns. And we did see, so that this happened because the initial lockdown in the UK corresponded with a period of extremely hot weather. So as a result of that, we did see a lot of outages and pressure losses because they physically couldn't get enough water into the network to meet this sustained household demand throughout the day. So yeah, this has resulted in a lot of changes in the way models have been adapted to understand daily usage. And we've seen we did see some initial impacts on the wastewater network as well, so with unfortunate disposal of things like milk and beer because of lockdowns and things like that. But there wasn't, mostly this happened through, there were agreements where businesses would be able to dispose of these things at night when there was less overall demand on the wastewater network. But it did increase the costs on the sort of treatment load in some areas for wastewater treatment systems. But overall, there were these initially fairly drastic shifts in demand, but the water companies did catch up. And as I say, it sort of introduced a new level of flexibility in how they're managing daily demand, and they're considering now how much of these changes, particularly the rise in household consumption, will be long-term. There was also an impact on the workforce as well for the water sector. Like every other sector, they also had to shift to home working, and they did so rapidly with their staff. There was a bit of research that's been done recently, and most seemingly in the sector, from those who were surveyed, felt that they were able to continue their usual role. So the general feeling was that from a workforce perspective, the water sector was fairly resilient to the pandemic and was able to adjust and still deliver the services that needed to be delivered. There were a few issues that came up, as with most sectors, IT infrastructure being slow to catch up. And I think obviously that is one of the things that's been highlighted. I think somebody in the previous session was mentioning how obviously the trend towards digitization of the water sector comes with a trade-off of reliance on IT infrastructure and the resulting vulnerabilities to failures in that IT infrastructure and cybersecurity and things like that. So I think the pandemic has really, really highlighted that since we've had to rely on IT infrastructure so much more. But overall, as I say, the sector was fairly resilient and has, at least in the short term, drastically increased efforts to support the well-being of staff, and again, as with a lot of other sectors, having to deal with stress and managing other caring requirements and things like that. But one of the more, I think, long-lasting and I think significant impacts from the pandemic was in the way it's highlighted these disparities, and this is the kind of thing that we've been talking about. Now, in the UK, it's already been the case for quite some time that household customers cannot be disconnected for non-payment of bills. So all of the water companies in this country do have tools in place to help support customers who cannot pay or who struggle to pay. And there's all kinds of tools that they rely on, but some of them are still fairly controversial. So one company estimated that they have it was something like around 4%. Yeah, it's about 4% of their customers were on these sort of plans or social tariffs, and they're effectively being subsidized, obviously, by the customers who can pay. And that still is fairly controversial. But up until this point, it wasn't really that significant an issue. But now that once the pandemic started to highlight some of the affordability issues that so many households are facing, particularly since water is so essential to hygiene and managing hygiene during the pandemic, it really sort of brought that into the crosshairs and made it, even more of a public concern. And this is going to have some long-term ramifications because as I say, the access to water services and adequate water services is essential to hygiene for not just in the pandemic, but I think particularly during the pandemic. And this will also have some long-term economic impact on the financing of the sector, which is something we've been talking quite a lot about. So what this has shown, and particularly the balance has shifted. And in the UK, there was always the ability to sort of manage the balance of income between non-household customer tariffs and household customer tariffs. And in some ways, they could shift some costs onto non-household customers to offset the affordability issues for household customers. But that's not the case really anymore, because of the shift to home working and so many business closures or restrictions. That balance of revenue is shifting more towards household customers. And still in the UK, a large portion of those are unmetered. And I think across the country, we're at around 40% metering. So the tariff model is totally different. Well, a little bit different. And so, and because of the long-term economic impacts of the pandemic itself, lockdowns and the resulting likelihood of recessions on the back of that, there's likely to be an increased reliance on the sort of concessionary models and social tariffs and financial support tools. So, and in the UK, we have a sort of a sector that has independent retailers. So wholesale services and retail services are independent for the non-domestic market. And the retailers certainly suffered from that because they were still liable for the wholesale costs. But all of their customers had stopped using anything because of the lockdown. So that was one area where the retailer the regulator had to step in and offer specific support mechanisms to the retailers to ease their cash flow during the lockdowns and keep them going in the face of non-household customers simply not being able to afford to pay anything. There have been some resulting delays in asset investment plans or predicted delays, I suppose, in asset investment plans as a result of some of this. And there's been concern about the diversion of public research funding as well, because obviously that's shifted drastically towards COVID responses. And has, a lot of water companies do get income from public research sources, and from an innovation perspective, that's had resulted in a significant rethink of what's going to be available. Although that's been offset a little bit by this growing interest in monitoring wastewater for viral load, and there's been a sort of surgence in funding around that. And all of this, of course, is further complicated by Brexit. It's not something I want to discuss, particularly given the uncertainty as over the weekend. But it's the financial picture, complicated as that is likely to be even further complicated because of Brexit. So there's one particular issue I wanted to just bring up, and I'll try and get through it quickly because this was true before. This was all decided pre-lockdown. So Ofwat, the regulator for England and Wales, as you probably know, has this price review process. And before the pandemic, there was an issue that had emerged because in this most recent price round, they had taken a particularly strict stance against water companies in England and Wales. And they had forced a lot of them to lower their bills and increase their spending profiles. So it was sort of well known as one of the strictest price review processes that they had undertaken, again, pre-pandemic. And as a result of that, 4 of the companies then challenged those determinations, and they challenged it on a particular basis, which was around resilience. So Ofwat's argument was that the bills should be more affordable. There was issues with dividends because obviously the sector's privatized. Dividends being paid to investors were too high, and that there were unrealized deficiencies that could be enforced through this process. But the companies argued that there wasn't enough funding provided in this determination to support particularly long-term resilience investments. And that was despite the fact that they could show in their evidence that customers actually did have an appetite to pay more to support long-term resilience investments. And this is one of the most interesting things about the sector in England and Wales. I think it's been mentioned before about this need to involve customers more and have more educated customers in understanding what they're paying for. And in the UK, that is a requirement. Companies do have to involve their customers quite heavily in the discussions around future financing. And so a lot of them had evidence to support the idea that customers were willing to pay more, higher tariffs to support long-term resilience investments. And actually, so this, again, this was done pre-pandemic. The argument was done pre-pandemic. The Competition and Markets Authority, which is where these disputes were referred to, has just recently issued a provisional decision on this. And on this particular point, they did kind of find in favor of the water companies in saying that there should be slightly higher bills and slightly more funding available to the companies to support long-term resilience investments. So I think partly that shows the strength of this customer involvement model that we have here, that the evidence of that was strong enough that the Competition Markets Authority agreed that there could be appetite for more investment in resilience. So Ofwat, and I think, I don't know if anyone from Ofwat's on the call, but I don't speak for them too much, but I think that decision, I think, did prompt a bit of a rethink in how they were approaching long-term resilience investments for the companies. And so this is from a report that literally just came out a few days ago, just last week. And they're looking to sort of, now there are consultations on the future towards the next price review process and things. And so obviously these types of issues are now front and center. How do we maintain that balance between affordability, public confidence, and long-term resilience investments? And if there's a bit, the reliance on tariffs, I think, is quite clear that it is going to be a challenge because of the drastic changes in the economic landscape that we're likely facing. So yeah, obviously we've discussed this before in the session, but all in all, it's highlighting the need for non-tariff based models for financing, and at the same time, I think speaks to the strength of involving customers in the discussions around their tariffs and what those tariffs are used for. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Heather. And I have to say that I was speaking to an ex-colleague from a very large water service in France, and actually with the pandemic and everything, they are thinking of upgrading their water treatment plant to a reverse osmosis, and they did a willingness to pay a study to make sure that their customers would be okay, to have more expensive water. And actually, when you do engage with customers, you explain why you do the investments. Everybody was sort of okay, with balancing the risks and the costs. People do understand, and so they're going to go on with the investment on those. On this reverse osmosis technology. And also this very same water service, the whole economic balance of the service is based on those big commercial customers. So as you've mentioned, when these people, either they go bankrupt or they just disconnect from the system, then obviously the utility is in really bad shape. So that was very, very interesting, I think, outcomes, let's say, of this weird period that we're going through.
Yes, indeed.
So I'll turn now to Robert for this international review of experiences with regard to water security in urban water services. So the floor is yours, and I know that you have some slides that Chiara will be managing for you, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. Hi, so today is more like an overview of what's going on around the world, a snapshot in a very short space of time of 10 minutes. The slides are packed with information that you are free to look at afterwards. So this will be a very fly through, 8 shots of what's going on around the world. Next slide. On urban water security. And by water security, we basically mean access to good quality water or sufficient quantity for both humans and nature itself, and ensuring that the socioeconomic development is achieved, but nature also has water, and we protect the nature itself while we take water for our own needs. Next slide. So basically, 3 key elements of achieving urban water security is ensuring access to safe and sufficient drinking water for humans at an affordable cost, protection of livelihoods, human rights and cultural and recreational values, and also preserving and protecting ecosystems, making sure that human health is also sustained while at the same time the ecosystems remain healthy and actually provide us with future ecosystem services for not just ourselves, but for future generations as well. Next slide. So in this context of my session, I'm looking at two aspects of how to achieve urban water security. We've got demand management, managing too little water, and then followed by green infrastructure. And so basically it's a very snapshot of, this is just the demand management side of actually implementing demand management around the world. What are people doing? So we talked about pricing a lot today. So water pricing, we see that Sydney's new flexible water pricing scheme has been approved in July of this year. Basically the pricing schedule is based around dam levels. So as a dam level is decreased, the price increases. Sydney's been in a very long drought. They've had forest fires, bushfires, which have actually, the sediments got into the water reservoirs as well. So they've been having quite a struggling time on top of the COVID. So basically water pricing, looking at a more innovative way of how to actually, connect what's happening on the ground, what's happening in that, environment to the demand itself. Next slide. And then we have looking at grants. So, we have a lot of fiscal tools available for demand management, and one particularly used more in North America is a grant. So in New York City, they've got a grant for on-site water reuse systems. What's novel about this is not simply a grant just for on-site water reuse system in the building itself, but actually developers can combine across the district or across a few buildings and actually build, whole on-site water reuse system for multiple buildings at the district level. This is for on-site non-potable use. So the on-site water reuse systems can be used for flushing toilets, washing sidewalks, streets and buildings, laundries, etc., irrigation systems. And basically, what's interesting about New York City is that it has one of the largest unfiltered water systems in the world, and in North America itself. And they have multi-year, abilities, but you can never be too, you have to always be cautious. And so they're moving into this on-site, which is, the regulatory system has been put down for this to be able to happen. So a lot of countries, this is very highly restricted. For instance, some European countries, there's huge barriers to being able to implement water reuse systems, and some countries are only just starting to think about it. Next slide. And looking at regulations, we always talk about, silos, and, water is always in the silo with energy and silo and food. What Boston has actually done is created a building energy reporting and disclosure ordinance that basically says all medium and large buildings in Boston have to report the energy and water usage. And every 5 years, they have to complete a major action to reduce basically the water energy nexus itself. And to be open and transparent about this, they've enabled this information to be put on a database. So the citizens can look at the database and see what buildings are doing and what the owners are doing and what the developers are doing. But also importantly is that building owners can then compare the energy and water usage of other buildings. So then when it comes to facility managers or they're looking at, or investors, they can see which buildings are more, higher returns, rate of returns, for example. And also by putting it into public information, it kind of puts pressure on, laggards to really step up and meet this new ordinance. And also there's also a competition because, developers and building owners, they want to outdo another building or example, or one company wants to outperform another. So there's always a little incentives here. And more interesting, just a pure regulation of this, you must achieve this much savings by this year. This puts it down to the public to create like role models as well. So buildings, the owners are kind of competing with each other. Next slide. And then we talk about smart meters, it's all the big thing around the world. So in San Francisco has actually up to 96% of all their customers actually have smart meters installed now. And what's really great is that the water utility can notify customers when they have leakage. And that's defined as 3 days of non-stop 24/7 use. That could be becoming a plumbing leak, for example, or someone just leaving a tap on, but at least the owner is told there's a leakage. And then customers can then log into their My account, and they can download their detailed daily and monthly water usage and learn ways of conserving water. They're also able to receive leak alerts, phones, emails, text messages on the dates of a leakage, the continuous, the actual amount itself. And when we look at the silos, like, our energy, you can log into your energy and see your daily consumption. So the energy sector is well more advanced than the water sector. So sometimes I feel like it's like dragging us into the 21st century and, bringing us up to a level of, what the energy sector already provides its customers. Just as a personal note, I can, here I can log into my account. I can see, energy usage of different times of the day, and I can see my heat map to show more intense during the days. That would be amazing one day if we have visibility in the water sector. I think one of the issues is that the pricing is always so low in water that if it was as high as energy, of course we'd have all those fancy technologies. So one of the, we have to find this really careful, way forward without charging too much, but also providing services which enable cities to become more resilient with future climatic extremes. Next slide. And, product labeling, this is really big in Europe, obviously, the labeling schemes. There's a Blue Angel in Germany and eco-labels in the Scandinavian countries. So as a mandatory label scheme in New Zealand, this covers products, and it just basically shows what water efficiency is for a product and what the water consumption level was for that particular product. It applies to washing machines and dishwashers, the usual things that most, US EPA covers as well. Has a star rating, so basically it's relative to water efficiency. The more stars, the better, more water efficient it is. And also the product label will tell you, could be telling you, water flow levels, etc. And labeling schemes always have to be, they have to be informative, they have to stand out, they have to be seen by customers. To really take note of these things. And sometimes, I haven't got an example here, but sometimes, water utilities or cities will actually provide, a grant or a rebate for, if you purchase like a high efficient product, you'll receive a rebate on this particular item. So this labeling scheme in particular is mandatory, and basically the key to this, regulatory scheme is to keep it simple, because not everyone is a water resource management professional. The simple customer needs to see what it is, and the overall objective naturally is to remove unsustainable products from the marketplace eventually via market forces, rather than having the government just put down regulations. But then other places, Singapore actually says, okay, any product that's labeled, like say 1 star, is not allowed to be sold on the market. You can actually do it that kind of way as well. So eventually, or you can make it all new developments or renovations of apartments, etc., must have installed, 5 out of 6 labeled washing machines and fixtures. So there's different ways of implementing regulations here. Next slide. And now we're looking at, managing too much water. Green infrastructure, water sensitive urban design, blue-green infrastructure, very different, different names, same thing. We're just managing water, too much water, how to improve water quality, how to, mitigate against climatic extremes in cities, how do you prevent localized flooding? And then the main thing is, what are the interesting ways of implementing green infrastructure in the cities? So next slide. So in Milwaukee, this is all obviously before every riots and things went crazy, and and budgets were there and things like that. So one of the things that they managed to implement was a stormwater fee reduction, basically. Very simple, that they've got a stormwater fee for the amount of surface water on impervious surfaces on their properties. And if the owner of a development implements green infrastructure, they receive a 60% discount off the stormwater fee. And it's reduced only to 60% to ensure that operation and maintenance costs are covered in the system. One of the, we always talk about command and control versus market-based instruments. And this is basically letting the customer decide what type of green infrastructure they would prefer or is more appropriate for their property type, rather than having the top-heavy, government coming down telling you you must have this, this, and this, and this. So this drives innovation. It drives, incentivizes, new ways of doing things, but while also mandating, that you must do it. If there is an ability without having to mandate it. So the market forces are put into play here. Next slide. And then we turn to Europe. We know Amsterdam is leading the way quite often in green roofs. They have a subsidy that provides green roofs based on the surface area. They're also moving into green walls and green facades, etc. Capped at 20,000 euros is awarded to individual projects. I believe, this is quite an innovative, thing for a European city, because quite often the European cities, very generalized here, do not use subsidies and other fiscal tools if they do it very sparingly and the budgets are very tight. We often see in North America and to a lesser extent Australia relying on subsidies and grants to really get the consumer and customer to do something they want. So this was an example that stood out to me, and what is amazing is it's been since 2010, and it's quietly pushing away because chugging forward to where you get the most of attention on Rotterdam, but Amsterdam is like, here we are, we had to do something. So that's quite a nice thing to also see, that the two cities drive each other, compete. Obviously Rotterdam has their new green roof subsidy they've implemented. They've developed one for this year, that continues even though the situation. So next slide. Awards and recognition schemes are also a very important tool, because it creates role models and people emulate people they look up to. And so this one was basically Kansas City created a KC Green Neighborhood Recognition Program, and it gave neighborhoods an ability to develop green infrastructure, implement sustainable practices, but also be rewarded for their initiatives they take. So that means the neighborhood could be, they will have their coverage of them in the local newspapers, on their cable channels, and they'll also have access to sustainability workshops, and also these eco-gifts to reward neighborhoods that progress well towards sustainability. These awards and recognition programs can be done on individual levels. It could be done on young children or who are looking after neighborhood things. They have the Rain Guardian program in San Francisco. They have all these different types of ways of rewarding people. School projects examples, other examples. Basically, at the end of the day, it's creating a role model. So rather than the government or the city telling you what you need to do, you can look at your neighbor and think, hey, they're doing that, why aren't we doing this? And that creates another angle that you can address. You can create, you can almost create a demand for something by using, citizens to drive it themselves, rather than mandating and regulatories, command and control style thing. Next slide. And then one of the interesting things is though that obviously, cities do need to take initiative and need to drive, the future and drive regulations, but also leadership. So what Melbourne's done is called the Green Your Lane pilot project. So they've taken, right away green lanes, and these lanes are usually, cafes and art and cultural things. So what they've done is they've greened them. And they chose it based on which lanes were to be done were chosen by the public. So they went in and greened these lanes, put green infrastructure in. And then what that does is creates almost a demonstration project. And that shows leadership to the people, to the city, to private businesses, that the city takes it seriously, and the city is actually showing what can be done, what's possible. And this is done in their public space in the right of ways. And then basically, very simple things, vertical greeneries and things to catch stormwater. Just more of a demonstration as what's possible in the future. And then obviously what your cities can do, regulatory powers can do, is then eventually, once it's shown to be viable and then the public demand it, then they can create a regulation and say, okay, we do this in the public right away, but we also mandate that in your private, large properties that you must implement green infrastructure. So that sometimes these, you're developing a demand for something. So by the time you regulate it, the people want it, is what I'm basically saying. Next slide. And information and awareness, back to Australia again. So what they did was they had this green roofs and walls policy, and to increase the number of green roofs and walls, they've provided guidelines and inspirational guidelines and a resource manual to help residents and businesses implement green walls and other types of stormwater infrastructure. And then also to have a map to show, green infrastructure across the city and to show what projects are possible. And that creates, we see these resource maps often now. We see them water leakages, they put up where you're in the city, where leaking water is. Green infrastructure, what sustainable businesses exist, we are the eco products and things like that. So by doing this, it then creates an incentive for people to show in their development that we're also doing something. So if you're a private owner, you're a facility manager or something of a private, corporation building, if you do that green infrastructure, you'll be able to put that up on a map and show your customers and your community that you're actually taking this seriously as well. So that drives this, this kind of circular thing. Instead of the city or the government telling you that you need to put up green walls, put out the guidelines, incentivize people to show what they're doing, show that to the city, to the residents, and then eventually, if you do want to regulate it, then the people will naturally say, well, why didn't we regulate it earlier? Why are we waited now? So it's kind of a good way. This is probably what we're seeing in Australia is more of a in between Europe and America, where rather than relying on subsidies, grants, rebates, and fees, they kind of in between this, let the free market work itself, very light touch, and we can see that in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, taking also that North American approach of saying, okay, we do already do that. We already show what's possible with greening the streets. So if they're introducing the whole, subsidies and rebate schemes itself. So that's the interesting part of it. And it's all down to systems of governance as well, and histories and cultures. Next slide. Okay, so that's the end. So I packed huge amounts of information, very brief around the world. And you can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, visit the website. I'm an open connector, so anyone that wants to connect with me, I accept. So thank you very much for this.
Thanks a lot, Robert. That's a very, very interesting international review and really a world tour of very inspiring experiences actually in urban water services and cities, obviously around the world to manage water risks. So I really thank you for that. Although we were running completely out of time, there was an interesting question from Milo on the chat for you, Ivailo. So if you still have a couple of minutes to bear with us and then maybe try to answer Milo. So the question is, why do you expect deterioration in natural capital following pandemics? Is it as a result of less economic resources available for climate change mitigation? So I'll give you the floor to answer, Milo.
Thanks a lot, Maria, and thanks, Milo, for the question. So it's it's a speculation, but what we know is that most of the countries around the world are going to face or are facing already economic recessions. So there will be a lot of pressure on governments for job creation. And the good thing is that IFI's European Commission are putting a lot of efforts on building better and greener. However, I'm still not that positive that the long-term infrastructure that we are talking about in our sectors will really be met with the short-term political thinking, and that at some point the environmental measures, climate change mitigation and adaptation measures would not be put on hold or put under the carpet for a bit. It is good thing that independent agencies as regulators do understand this issue and are focusing a bit more on the long-term approach and regulation and supporting utilities and sectors. However, I'm still not seeing this done by governments, and as I mentioned, it's tough political decisions that in these uncertain times we're about to see happening. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I'm a very bad time manager. That's for sure now. So I'm sorry for our three last panelists because we won't have time, obviously, to exchange further on the international review of examples that you've shared with us, Robert, on the specific and very interesting results of what you've been studying, Heather, in post-pandemic or during the pandemic, and what are the changes that water utilities are facing in England and Wales. I'm sorry for that because I mean I had so many questions, but thank you so much for joining us and for not being so regarding on the bad time management. So I'll just wrap up by saying thank you to all our panelists, to all our participants. The point of going through the entire obviously discussion is that everything is recorded, so there is a replay that will be available online for people who want to reconnect and listen to the podcast and the replay of the webinar. Also, if the panelists do agree, we would like to share their presentation in PDF on the web page of the event, so that people can go back to their slides. And Chiara from the FSR will get back to you to collect all these materials. Well, thank you very much, and stay tuned the next year because we'll have more events on water and waste at the FSR, and also some more research and webinars. So stay tuned. Have a good day, and thank you so much for your time and all your fantastic